Welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. In this video, we are going to discuss the quintessential cards needed to build the core of a sacrifice-themed commander deck with Muldrotha the Gravetide as its general. Muldrotha the Gravetide debuted in Dominaria and is a 6/6 elemental avatar for 3 in Sultai colors. During each of our turns, we may play up to one permanent card of each permanent type from our graveyard. Notice the text on Muldrotha. It says play up to one permanent card. It does not say cast. This means that we can play land cards from our graveyard. It should be noted that we can play a land from our graveyard with Muldrotha as long as we have an available land drop to do so. Our general does not allow us to play an additional land on our turn. Our general does, however, want to utilize our graveyard as an extension of our hand during each of our turns. We are tasked with ensuring that our graveyard is stockpiled with permanent cards for the purposes of utilizing Muldrotha's ability. The core of this build will focus on optimizing value through activated and triggered abilities, in addition to providing numerous outlets for filling our graveyard with permanent cards. Through the utilization of this value engine, we will out-resource our opponents on the path to imminent victory. We begin the core of this build with a slew of easy-to-sacrifice permanent cards that provide us resources and assist us in controlling the battlefield. Using and reusing these cards from our graveyard through Muldrotha ensures game-long accelerated resources and optimized battlefield management. If we tap and sacrifice Nihil Spellbomb, then we exile target player's graveyard. When this artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, if we pay a black mana, then we draw a card. Mishra's Bauble draws us a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep after we tap and sacrifice it. By doing so, we look at the top card of target player's library. We can sacrifice Secure a Tribe Elder and search our library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Seal of Primordium can be sacrificed to destroy target artifact or enchantment. For 1 and a green mana, we can sacrifice Caustic Caterpillar to do the same. Haywire Might's sacrifice ability only costs 1 green mana in order to exile target non-creature artifact or non-creature enchantment. Notice that this non-creature artifact or enchantment is exiled, not destroyed. There aren't many problematic or troublesome cards that fit this description in the EDH format, right? As a bonus, whenever Haywire Might dies, we gain 2 life. Aether Spellbomb has 2 different sacrifice abilities. For 1 blue mana, we can return target creature to its owner's hand. For any 1 mana, we can draw a card. Seal of Removal doesn't need any mana to activate it. We simply sacrifice it and return target creature to its owner's hand. Seal of Doom follows suit, but instead of bouncing target creature, it destroys target non-black creature instead, and it can't be regenerated. Pernicious Deed doesn't discriminate based upon a creature's color. It simply destroys each creature, artifact, and enchantment with mana value X or less. Note that we can pay 0 for X, sacrifice Pernicious Deed, and destroy every token that is a creature, artifact, and enchantment on the battlefield. Glenalendra Archmage is a counter-magic threat throughout the game. We may pay a blue mana and sacrifice her to counter-target non-creature spell. She also has Persist, so when Glenalendra dies, if she had no -1/-1 counters on her, then we return her to the battlefield under our control with a -1/-1 counter on her. For the same 1 blue mana, Siren's Storm Tamer counters target spell or ability that targets us or a creature we control. With these 2 creatures on our side of the battlefield, our opponents may think twice about their spell-casting decisions. Speaking of thinking twice, Spore Frog will give our opponent something to think about as it relates to combat. We can sacrifice it to prevent all combat damage dealt this turn. If our creatures are being sacrificed in these ways, then we must play with a copy of Dictate of Erebus. Whenever a creature we control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. This is a powerful way to manage our opponent's battlefields. Since our creatures will be doing a lot of the heavy lifting in this build, it's only fitting that we maximize their potential by including a litany of potent enter the battlefield triggers. Whether we're casting them from our hand or from our graveyard, providing resource acceleration or battlefield management will make it easier to claim victory. Baleful Strix draws us a card, while Muldrotha draws us 2 cards. We mill 3 cards when Stitcher's Supplier comes into play or dies, and Eternal Witness returns any card from our graveyard to our hand. Farhaven Elf puts any basic land from our library onto the battlefield tapped, while Wood Elves puts any forest card from our library into play. Solemn Simulacrum puts a basic land into play from our library and draws us a card when it dies, while Springbloom Druid puts 2 basic lands from our library into play tapped if we sacrifice a land when it comes into play. Both Reclamation Sage and Foundation Breaker can destroy target artifact or enchantment when they enter the battlefield, while Acidic Slime destroys target artifact, enchantment, or land. Each player sacrifices a creature whenever Fleshbag Marauder, Merciless Executioner, or Gravelighter enters the battlefield. If a creature died this turn, then we draw a card from Gravelighter when it comes into play. Plaguecrafter and Demon's Disciple extend the forced sacrifice to either creatures or planeswalkers, and in the case of Plaguecrafter, each player who can't make the sacrifice discards a card. When Shriekmaw comes into play, we destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature. Ravenous Chupacabra is not as restrictive. It destroys target creature an opponent controls when it enters the battlefield. Not all of our permanents can get into our graveyard by themselves, and since we want our graveyard to be teeming with reusable options, it's up to us to provide various ways of filling it. We can sacrifice creatures to Viscera Seer, Phyrexian Altar, and Altar of Dementia in order to, respectively, scry 1, add 1 mana of any color, or have target player mill cards from the top of their library equal to the sacrificed creature's power. We can sacrifice a creature to Greater Good and draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, and then discard 3 cards. Both the sacrifice and discard requirements of this enchantment are excellent ways of maximizing our casting permanent spells from our graveyard capacity. At the beginning of our end step, Braid's Arisen Nightmare allows us to sacrifice an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker. If we do, then each opponent may sacrifice a permanent that shares a card type with it. For each opponent who doesn't, they lose 2 life and we draw a card. Speaking of drawing cards, whenever 1 or more land cards are put into our graveyard from anywhere, the Gitrog monster draws us a card. At the beginning of our upkeep, we sacrifice the Gitrog monster unless we sacrifice a land, and we may play an additional land on each of our turns. This frog horror powerfully synergizes with Muldrotha, as each turn's sacrifice land can be played from the graveyard. Jarad, Golgari Lichlord, allows us to pay 1 in Golgari colors to sacrifice another creature. Each opponent loses life equal to the sacrificed creature's power. Jarad also gets +1/+1 for each creature card in our graveyard, and we can sacrifice a swamp and a forest to return him from our graveyard to our hand. Jarad can get creatures and lands into our graveyard for the purposes of utilizing Muldrotha's ability. Speaking of utilizing Muldrotha's ability, Lord of the Forsaken allows us to pay 1 life to add a colorless mana. We can only use this mana to cast spells from our graveyard, which is what Muldrotha wants us to do. We can also pay a black mana and sacrifice another creature in order to have target player mill 3 cards. Due to the presence of Muldrotha, I sense that we will target ourselves with this ability more often than not. We can lighten the burden of responsibility placed on Muldrotha by including some peripheral graveyard effects. Crucible of Worlds and Ramunap Excavator allow us to play lands from our graveyard. World Shaper returns all lands from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped when it dies, in addition to having a self-mill ability that puts the top 3 cards of our library into our graveyard whenever it attacks. Kaya's ghost form returns enchanted creature or planeswalker to the battlefield and under our control when it dies or is put into exile, while Animate Dead returns target creature card from our graveyard to play as long as it remains attached to the creature. For the cost of 1 and 1 black mana and 2 life, we can return target creature card from our graveyard to our hand with Phyrexian Reclamation. One of the most resourceful creatures to target with this effect is Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, we gain 3 life, draw a card, and may put a land card from our hand onto the battlefield. When it comes into play, we sacrifice it unless it escaped. We want to play the cards in our graveyard, so exiling 5 of them for the purposes of casting Uro with its escape mechanic is not preferable here. It is much more advantageous to pay 1 in Simic colors to cast Uro from our hand. We sacrifice it when it comes into play, we gain 3 life, we draw a card, we play a land. We pay 1 and a black mana and 2 life with Phyrexian Reclamation and return Uro from our graveyard to our hand. Rinse, lather, repeat, create a chasm-like discrepancy in resources between us and our opponents. For more graveyard shenanigans, Canoptic Tomb Sentinel's Unearth ability allows us to cast it from our graveyard, and when we do, we exile target non-land permanent when it enters the battlefield. If we unearth the Sentinel, then it is exiled at the beginning of the next end step. For something to look forward to, repeatedly casting and sacrificing the Sentinel from our graveyard through Muldrotha's ability could be backbreaking for our opponents. Speaking of backbreaking, at the beginning of our upkeep, Sheoldred, Whispering One, returns target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player sacrifices a creature, as if our opponents would have any creatures left on their sides of the battlefield anyways. It's time to bring this video to a close by including some cards that synergize with and enhance our sacrifice theme. Since our graveyard is a focal point to the core of this build, let's add some additional peripheral benefits to this dynamic. Gravebreaker Lamia reduces the cost of spells we cast from our graveyard by 1, and when it comes into play, we search our library for a card and put it into our graveyard. This enter the battlefield trigger is Entomb on the body of a 4/4 with lifelink. Whenever we cast a spell from our graveyard, Secrets of the Dead draws us a card. River Kelpie nets us a card whenever any player casts a spell from their graveyard, and not just us. As if that weren't enough, whenever River Kelpie or another permanent enters the battlefield from our graveyard, we draw a card. As if that weren't enough, River Kelpie also has Persist. This beast just gives and gives and gives. Continuing our focus on the graveyard, Ashiok Dream Render has a -1 loyalty ability that makes target player mill 4 cards and then exiles each opponent's graveyard. More often than not, the targeted player will be us because we want as many options for Muldrotha as possible. Ashiok also locks down our opponents from searching their libraries, a very powerful and oppressive effect that should not be overlooked. Our opponents will not make that mistake. If we were to draw a card, instead, Underrealm Lich lets us look at the top 3 cards of our library. We put 1 of them into our hand and the rest into our graveyard. This filtering ability powerfully synergizes with Muldrotha and our graveyard theme, and the Lich should be considered one of the most important cards in the core of this build. The Lich's indestructible until end of turn ability gives it staying power on the battlefield as well. Since Muldrotha has a healthy mana value of 6, it's a good idea to provide some protection. If our opponents have any Muldrotha-related malice in their hearts, and they probably will, then Lightning Greaves will prevent any spot removal. Sylvan Safekeeper does the same, but it's a temporary effect and we must sacrifice a land in order to activate it. These are economic options which should serve this build very well. Lastly, although this dynamic is not for everyone, and rarely is praised by opponents, including Vidalcan Orrery and Leyline of Anticipation allows us to cast spells as though they had flash. If the Leyline is in our opening hand, then we begin the game with it on the battlefield. When either of these cards is paired alongside Omniscience, the game should end soon after. or even sooner if our opponents decide to concede. Imagine if our side of the battlefield is littered with sacrifice outlets. We could continuously loop a sacrifice and cast from our graveyard synergy, all without paying the mana costs for any of these spells. That means the game is over. This video provided a blueprint for building the core of a sacrifice-themed commander deck around Muldrotha the Gravetide as its general. Removal spells, disruption, ramp, and the land base can vary from build to build, and also are dependent on metagame preferences and availability. The cards discussed during this video are suggested options for crafting the core of a sacrifice-themed EDH deck, in addition to providing ways to optimize this theme. Let me know your thoughts about these recommendations in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic.